Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, sponsored a commission on China and COVID-19, releasing a report on Monday asserting that China's government must be held accountable for the pandemic, which cost 28 million lives, more than that. The commission was formed to review the origins of COVID-19. A contributor to the report, Jamie Metzl, wrote on X, "We assert that China's government is primarily responsible for COVID-19 and liable for 18 trillion in damages to the United States. We also lay out a very specific and highly realizable plan for holding China to account. I'm already in touch with members of Congress about potential implementing legislation. China's 4.5 years of impunity for COVID-19 will likely soon come to an end."
This stance has been under criticism that singling out China has spurred racism and racist reactions. Author of the new book, Superconvergence, How the Genetics, Biotech, and AI Revolutions Will Transform Our Lives, Work, and World, Jamie Metzl joins us now to discuss. Thanks for coming on, Jamie. Really want to get into this. So, Jamie, help us understand precisely how the Chinese government is responsible for COVID origins. Do you tie this to the Wuhan Institutes of Virology? Help us understand precisely how you pin China or the Chinese government as the culprit.
So there are two separate and separable issues. The first is, how did the initial spillover jump to humans? And on that, our commission, and I was a commissioner, I'm a Democrat, but our commissioners included Democrats and Republicans, high-level former officials from both parties. Our unanimous view was that the most likely cause of the initial spillover was a research-related incident in Wuhan. But regardless of how that initial spillover may have happened, China also carried out a massive cover-up, particularly in those critical first weeks and months, that basically denied China and the world the tools that would have made it possible to prevent the entire pandemic. And that involved destroying samples, hiding records, imprisoning Chinese journalists, establishing a gag order on Chinese scientists, blocking any meaningful international investigation, lying to the international community about human-to-human transmission, not sharing the genome sequencing information about the virus. And these behaviors played a very essential role in bringing us the entire pandemic. So this was a political pandemic, but for the unique pathologies of the Chinese state, there are very, very likely would have been no pandemic at all. And so that is the very strong determination of our commission. We did a calculation of total cost. So there were over 28 million deaths globally, excess deaths, over 1 million excess deaths in the United States. And the economic cost to the United States alone, we estimate at about $18 trillion. And if China is given a pass, then we can expect even worse behavior next time. And that's what happened with the first SARS 20 years ago. China really screwed up. It wasn't held accountable. And now we have SARS-2. And if we don't hold China accountable and establish new standards, we're going to get SARS-3 or something else, and it's going to be much worse than what we've seen. So now is the time when we need to take very significant steps towards greater accountability.
So even if one concedes that China does bear, the Chinese government, significant responsibility for everything you described and should be held accountable in some fashion, I'm sure some people will say, you know, that's such a large amount of money. Is it even, possible to hold a government to account, that figure? What would it look like to actually make the Chinese government pay that to the citizens of the United States, to the surviving family members?
Let me be clear. We are not going to get an $18 trillion check in the mail from China that we can go to the local bank and cash. That's not going to happen. But the fact of the matter is that it's been more than 4.5 years since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And nothing has been done to hold China accountable. China has experienced complete impunity, and the international community has displayed complete impotence. So that needs to change. In our report, we have 18 different recommendations. But the most important recommendation that we have is for an amendment, and forgive the legalese, to a law called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And so what that does, as the name suggests, is it makes it very difficult to sue foreign governments. And there is an amendment to that was passed in 2016, which allowed for suits to go forward on issues of support, material support for terrorism. And that's why there was a multi-billion-dollar settlement with the Arab Bank on terrorist financing. And what we're saying is we need to decentralize the accountability process. So we're already meeting with members of Congress to discuss this very small amendment to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which would essentially say that U.S. courts have jurisdiction over claims against China, or frankly, against any government that sparks, directly or indirectly, a global pandemic, killing more than 1 million, leading to the excess deaths of more than 1 million Americans, where that government has failed to carry out or allow a comprehensive and unfettered investigation into the origins of the outbreak. So in that very narrow and tailored circumstance, U.S. courts would have jurisdiction. And so what we're essentially doing is unleashing these very powerful and aggressive U.S. mass tort lawyers on the Chinese government, with Chinese assets in the United States as potentially being attachable. And that's not $18 trillion of assets, but it's a whole lot of assets.
The Wuhan Institutes of Virology was partnered with a New York-based lab and did receive resources from the United States to conduct a part of their resource. Do you see an argument to be made that the U.S. was in part responsible in some way and therefore should also be financially responsible for damages? Or is the argument just that the Chinese government's handling of the information after discovering the genesis of COVID, that the COVID-19 variation existed, that what they did with that information was irresponsible by not sharing it with the international community? Or is it just the creation of COVID potentially in a lab is a huge part of the culpability of the Chinese government as well?
It's our view that the Chinese government bears primary responsibility for the COVID-19 pandemic. But it is also true that Chinese scientists were utilizing scientific techniques that were developed using support with government support from the United States, from the NIH. I was deeply involved in the issue of CRISPR babies that were born in China in 2018. It was very similar. U.S. National Institutes of Health funding went to support the development of CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. And we live in a world of open science. And there were Chinese scientists who came to the United States and learned these techniques. And scientists around the world had access to these techniques. And then scientists in China engaged in the highly unethical behavior. So is the National Institutes of Health, the United States government, responsible for the Chinese CRISPR babies? Somebody could make that argument, but primary responsibility attaches to China. Certainly in this case, there was a very small amount of NIH funding passed through the EcoHealth Alliance that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. By the exact letter of those grants, there is no possibility that funding, if according to the letter of the grants, could have led to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But the core issue is that the United States government was providing resources to a country, essentially, and certainly a laboratory where we didn't have complete access and complete visibility into what was going on. And this is the case over decades. I mean, the United States had a philosophy that if we welcomed China into the WTO, if we encouraged our companies to invest in China, if we sent our investment banks, allowed our investment banks to operate there, China would become part of the world community. And certainly we've had lots of scientific collaborations with China. Is the United States responsible for everything that comes out of those collaborations as the Chinese government becomes much more aggressive? Is Goldman Sachs responsible for those collaborations that help China grow wealthier? An argument can be made to that effect. But what we're saying here is that the Chinese government is primarily responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's certainly the view of our commission.
Jamie Metzl, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.